Ken is currently director of CalSWEC Title IV-E program in the Department or School of Social Work at San Diego, and his experience in practice is in child welfare, mental health, aging, and community work. And in addition to his practice, he has been a chair of the Department of Social Work at Humboldt State and MSW director. Good morning, Ken.
Hi.
I guess it's afternoon. Yeah. So I want to start with kind of at the beginning for you of how you became a social worker and what influenced you to come into this field.
Well, it's good to see you, Pam. So I think the fun part would be to kind of start back, really, about my life, because being Japanese American, growing up in Southern California in a predominantly white community, and having parents who spoke primarily Japanese, that's a big part of my life experience. I grew up on a farm, went to school with predominantly kids who weren't Japanese, and so I knew I was different from the very beginning. It wasn't a negative thing when I was a child. I had a great time and everything, but I saw at different times different experiences my parents had, in particular with people at stores or other settings, in which sort of the prejudice and sort of the racist feelings emerged often, and it was kind of confusing as a child because my parents were very loving and thoughtful people in my life. And so I would say some of that is an important influence in my life, in the sense that I knew them to be good people, and I could see them go places and be treated less than. And I think it always stuck in my head trying to understand why people would do that. So I had that part of my life at the beginning. And then the other part about growing up on a farm as a child is that we got to play, and you had this huge area to play. And one of the nice things about it is that my friends and I would have to be creative every day. We'd have to find something to do. And we weren't, my family was pretty poor, I would say, during that time period. And as a kid, of course, you're not thinking that way, but you had to find pieces of wood and hammer and nail and think of what you were going to make if you wanted to float something down the gully, or if you're trying to build something, you got shovels and you went out and dug holes, And so the energy and sort of the activity with each other to think, what are we going to do today? How are we going to do it? Always trying to figure a little twist to it to make it more interesting. These are kinds of early life experiences, but I value them so much because, one, you like the idea that you were constructing something, that you were imagining something and you were creating something. And even as a child, you could go away at the end of the day feeling really satisfied. It might have been a silly thing you did, but it was different, and you had come up with it. So I would say those are early influences. The other part that later comes into my life that brings me into social work too is that school, for whatever reasons, was relatively a very comfortable, easy place for me. I had a lot of early successes and got a lot of acknowledgement and recognition for doing well. And so, not so much about academics, at least I don't mean it that way. What I really mean from that experience is that it kind of gave me some confidence underneath everything to trust myself. And I think the love and the affection of my parents and the stability of sort of that I could always count on them. My mother was always interested in what I was doing, no matter what their days were like. And when I look back at their lives and realize how much difficulties and pain and challenges they faced, I was always thoughtful about the fact that they could have easily turned out to be angry or bitter people. And both of them weren't. They were both very loving and patient, and like I said, my mother was always encouraging and excited to hear what else I was doing. So I think all of those influences, kind of unknown to me at that age, were really setting the stage for the things that would become important. And then you have to remember, I'm old, and so as a 15-year-old, it was 1968, and I was very interested in the news, and so I read a lot. And 1968 was a watershed year. You know, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, the Chicago Convention, a Democratic Convention took place. All of these enormous social events were occurring, and what I was saturated with was seeing that people outside of where I was living, because it wasn't happening in Anaheim where I lived, that outside of this little world I was in was all of this activity and activism that was going on. And being young, it inspired me. The civil rights movements going on, anti-war efforts going on, seeing people who look like me being the source of hate and anger, being called gooks, and then I started to have those experiences in high school, going places and people saying very harsh things. You know, go back home. You know, go back from where you're from. You gook. You know, and trying to figure out how that fit in with this other world I had growing up, which was had wonderful friends, had a great social life, and had great experiences while I was in school. So I would say all of those influences geared me to begin to think about, well, what kind of world I wanted to be a part of. And I think the social forces at those times, in the late 60s and early 70s, left many of us who were young to kind of question how did we want to live our lives and what kinds of things we wanted to do. So by the time I got to Berkeley, I was an undergrad at Berkeley, I knew I wanted to find something different to do. It wasn't just to go to class and get my grades and continue. So I started volunteering. I volunteered on a Berkeley switchboard, which was a helpline for the area. I volunteered at an elementary school. I volunteered at a child care center, and UC Berkeley child care center was really a very important time in my life at 19. It was a group of people older than I was. I think most of them were 6 to 15 years older than I was. And I was included. We made decisions together. Didn't matter that I was less experienced. I could participate to whatever level I wanted to. It was a very collective effort to govern. We shared everything with families, and so the parents participated in the governance of the program, and I just learned so much. And in that process, all of these things were questioned. I was actually on a child care staff that people won't believe, but we had 8 men and 4 women on the staff. And it was a very conscious choice of all of us as men to think about what it meant as young men taking care of children. And so we had all kinds of discussions about what's the relationship that we want between men and women, what kinds of models we want to offer children in terms of what a future could be. And it was a very diverse ethnic staff. And so every day was learning something, and every day it was adjusting and thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. So I'm somebody who kind of deferred my undergrad years. I stretched them out. And I got involved in lobbying in Sacramento for legislation related to child welfare. I worked closely with families and had the opportunity to help create some support groups for single parents. And at each process, I started to learn how all of these pieces went together, right? The kind of impact on legislation to free up resources for people who would have otherwise not had services or supports. And then at the same time within families, what it meant for a child to be separated from their mother or their father, even if it was for a short time, even if it was in a safe environment, and what it took to comfort them, and what it took to kind of help free them to enjoy their environment while their parent was away. They might sound like small things, but they all combined with my earlier life experiences to make me really begin to question why were the inequalities that we face so obvious to people and so little being done. So, I just had such great experiences in that combination that social work became something that I wasn't really conscious of. I really wasn't thinking social work, but I had a social worker who worked in the program, and just seeing what he did made it very easy for me to say to myself, I could do that. I like working with families. I don't mind meeting with people and talking to them. But I went to Berkeley as a MSW, my degree's from there, and I'm never, I can't say that it was the educational experience in and of itself that made me become so committed towards social work. I would just say that all of the experiences in the Bay Area started to come together for me, in which I felt more hopeful and more positive about committing to a particular field. I liked the fact that social work claimed social justice was one of its guiding principles, and so that really sort of became the driving force for me. What does that look like? And wherever I've gone in my life, that's been the important piece to me. How do you participate in sort of changing the world that we live in? And what is it that we can actually do together to make that happen? So I'd say a lot of those influences, being from an ethnic background, being Japanese American, seeing firsthand the ways that appearance alone can deny or provide support, and then I think just the combination of both luck and motivation to feel free to explore things. And I hope over the years that my students have gained that sense from me, which is that it's so important to not be afraid to think creatively about how to address situations and not worry about whether it's possible or not, or whether to be defined by somebody else's determination, whether it's realistic or not. But the vision of seeing something that could be better by itself generates a kind of energy and motivation to talk and to think and to do things with others. And out of those experiences, greater possibilities occur. And so I think when I talk about influences in my life, there's so many. There's so many wonderful people who, at the right time, were there for me and allowed me to participate and do things. I think in some ways today's world is a little more narrow for emerging social workers. Not that it has to be, but I believe that in some ways our education, our workplaces, they're becoming more and more confining on what an identity of a social worker is. And I think it's paramount that new social workers are encouraged to see that actually it's the higher values and the principles that we want to be guided by should determine our acts and our choices. And it will be so much greater if agencies and schools continue to promote that as the critical issue. How do you create an emerging social work population that's actually driven seriously by social justice and are given the space to be creative and innovative in their work?
Thanks, Ken. Well, let's play with that a little bit. What would that look like? If you could share a little bit about, like you're saying, it seems very narrow now, and what would it look like if it wasn't, if it was more along the lines of social justice? and community.
Yes.
It would be good to hear your vision of that.
Well, I think it's occurring in different places, and I think it's particularly critical. Of course, our social conditions affect everyone, but I think in particular for whether immigrants or refugees or particularly diverse ethnic communities, if we look at any of our services that we provide, we see immediately that certain groups of color are particularly impacted. The outcomes are typically poor. The need to have to be involved with the service is greater. The length of time in any of the services is longer. If it's child welfare, families are still more often separated, more often less likely to reunify, more likely for young people to end up in foster care. So it's not that it's not obvious to people that in every service, whether it's healthcare or education or any of our social services, we continually see the same outcomes that reflect an inequality that we have. And so it's not as if people aren't trying, it's not as if people don't come up with different things, but one of the things that our organizations and our services continue to fail to do is to have confidence and trust in the communities that are most impacted. And why we create jobs and delivery of services in such a way that our new social workers spend so little time within the community. They spend the bulk of their time in an agency. They may see, when they think of community, they're going out to see individual families and trying to address individual problems, when we know the issues are far larger, that they're pervasive, and that unless they join with people in the community to determine their future, the level of participation and change is going to be minimal. And we see it over and over, but there's become a gap and a distance between actual community life and actual service providers' lives. And the painful thing is that many social workers feel frustrated because they feel their jobs are often defining what they can do and what they can't do. I'd like to think we provide an educational preparation that with experience we should be able to have confidence and trust the judgment of people who want to engage with the community to make a difference. So that's one way I could see as a shift, regardless of the service. How do you get social workers to spend more time out in the communities, working with people in the community and helping the community organize around things that are important to them? And when we've done that, Humboldt County, having spent those years teaching and being up in Humboldt and doing community work, we had a lot of opportunities to do that, and you see the benefits once that happens. Getting a chance to work closely with some wonderful people in the Hmong community. It's powerful to watch people begin to articulate to you what is most important to them, and if the opportunities could happen, how much it would mean to them. And it's so often contrary or different than what other people are thinking they need or should be happening for them. And when we work together to sort of highlight those desires of the community, bringing people together, the power of those conversations and the dialogue among people often led to activities or opportunities that weren't there. And it changes. It changes the way people see themselves. It changes the ways they hope for their children. Life is still difficult, but the desires become more and more important. Before I left Humboldt, I got to work with some wonderful women who were doing paso a paso, working directly with the community around women who were having or were pregnant or having their first child. And the women themselves knew so much, not only about their community, but they understood the challenges and the heartache of the community in terms of being able to be full participants in Humboldt County. And that kind of program in which they know what they need to learn and they know what they need to do, then they need allies like ourselves to be able to be present, to provide those supports, offer those encouragements, but to trust and believe that what they're envisioning is going to be something that's powerful for their community, and it has been, you know. So there's lots of examples that people are doing things together, and I think that's the challenge, having been a practitioner and then going into teaching, was that I had to conceptualize a way for myself to see how do you communicate and foster and encourage new people coming into the field. Something that I felt very comfortable with doing, but it was unclear to me how to convey that through teaching initially. So I think your question about, well, what's that look like? I think there are lots of examples and lots of experiences that lead to that, but I think the world we live in makes that a little more challenging to believe. People have come back around to wanting to believe there's a way to identify what's the best way to do things. And that would be wonderful, except we know the diversity among people would already tell us that one way can't simply meet everyone's needs. And we would be far better off if we created a diverse range of ways that people could achieve something or acquire something or participate in things. And I think a lot of my life's work was trying to create those avenues for people who were excluded, to be included in different places and to change the way the conversations were going so that they could actually participate and be involved.
This may be difficult to answer, I'm not sure, but I'm thinking as people are watching this, they are thinking, how does Ken do this? And I know all the decades we've worked together and I've known you, I've been able to be present for that. So I don't know if it's possible, but like, how does one manifest or put into practice these incredible principles that you talk about in terms of being present, in terms of listening, in terms of seeing people as the experts in their own lives?
Well, I think it's so important to, clearly, we're moving where the language says that, but the actions don't mirror that, right? And so how do you do that? I go back to some of the things I was saying earlier. I think my mother fostered that in some ways. Incredibly bright woman, due to circumstances, leaves Japan to marry my father as a picture bride. My father happens to be a farmer, so all of her preparation, abilities, her knowledge in finance, all of that is really not useful to go out and cut lettuce or pick cucumbers or do things. And yet she could do that. She didn't complain. She didn't see it as a lack or a misfortune. She went out, took care of us every morning, got us off, went out in the fields, worked, come back, prepare lunch, do everything. In the afternoon, go back out and work a few hours, and then be home to pick us up from school. And she was curious about me, right? What was I learning? And so as I get older and I look at those things, then I think to myself, like, how does someone sustain that? You have to have... these words are tricky because people attach their own meanings to them, but ultimately you have to have an enormous faith in life, right? You have to fully believe that your life has some meaning or purpose to be here. you don't even have to define it or know it. You just simply have to deeply believe that and trust that you have the ability to make sense of the world as you have to face it, right? So I can picture my mother in so many different ways, and my father too, but my mother in some ways because she was often the one who showed more directly through her conversations with me an interest, and I know what that did for me. And in order to be able to share, I had to sort of be able to reflect and think what I wanted to say, and why did some things matter to me. There was never a judgment, and there never was, well, don't do this or don't do that. It was always of interest of how or why that mattered to me. So I think in some ways I take that with me everywhere I go. But the other part is, even when I was working with young children, you learn very quickly, if you get to work with so many different children, that people not only develop in different ways, their interest is attracted to various things, and as long as you're willing to shift your presence to be there with them, you watch them flourish. You know, their conversation gets more excited and animated if you really want to know what they're doing. If they want comfort and they just want to sit and be quiet, and you're just quiet, it's the most peaceful moment for them, right? And so you learn to do things because it seems to help people. And as I got older and into very different environments, I kept finding that to be true. You know, if I was in the home of a family in East Palo Alto, when I worked here in the Bay Area, African-American family, had been unhappy with the way they had services, and my first inclination would be to want to tell them I'm not going to be like that. But I'm grateful that most of the time, I'm sure there weren't other times, but most of the time I would catch myself and just let them tell me why they were so unhappy with previous experiences. And in that process of sitting with them, you could hear their own tone and thinking change too. They could start complaining about something, but halfway into it they would also acknowledge it was a time when they were struggling and they weren't receptive. Or that they didn't trust someone because of the way they looked. And then in the next sentence say, I wish people wouldn't treat me that way too, right? And so just giving people space to sort through their own thoughts was often a powerful way for them to begin to believe that I wanted to be there for them. And I did. So I think I learned that through my work with young children, through my family, through my work experiences here in the Bay Area, so that by the time I was teaching at Humboldt, I struggled so much at the beginning because I wanted to be a good teacher. I wanted to be a good instructor. I wanted them to turn out to be great social workers. And I think there were early stages where I just felt so out of sorts with myself. But I think the power of my work at some point is when I began to figure out that teaching was very much like everything else I had been doing. And the materials, the content looked different, but the experience could be the same. And you know, what I loved about my teaching time is that I wanted the educational experience. Well, I guess to be honest, I wanted the learning and the teaching to be different, right? I had gone through school. I'd gone to Berkeley. I got my degrees. I liked my experience. In general, I thought it was good. But I also knew that it worked for me because school was relatively easy for me. I didn't care whether there were tests or papers. I could do those things. But I never felt that they were really the experiences that people wanted to struggle and talk about. So when I started to shift my thinking while I was teaching at Humboldt, I really wanted to find this balance between the collective experience for everybody in class and how to provide that through my presence to set a tone or create an environment or offer some kind of message that this was important, that it was a collective experience. at the same time, I wanted to reach each of them individually and wanted to figure out how they could find their own uniqueness within a group context, and that both could be true. And I think that's how I see community development, community organizing, and work in general, is that the challenge is a choice you take on, which is how do you create environments in which it's inclusive, that everyone can participate, and at the same time, how do people begin to critically look at what those differences are? And not that people have to, but that people would want to find some way to resolve where the ethical balance of the work needed to be, and that people could pursue that with compassion, with caring, with affection, and then at the same level, motivation and drive for change. I just look back, and it's a little humbling about this recognition, because I work with so many wonderful people, and we don't live in a world where everyone gets acknowledged for their unique contributions. And so to have some recognition when others don't, the only way I can hold on to that is to think that I am just given the chance to reflect back the beauty of all of that work that people have created and participated, and what emerged during the times I was together with them, because there really are shared experiences that matter. So I don't know if I'm making it very clear, but I think that social work becomes, it's not something that already exists. It's imperative on us to continually create what that means. And I think for me that's the challenge. If it's in teaching, it's not what is it that I am going to teach and provide, and how critical is that? It's this dynamic that's to pay attention to, which is the learning process, and the engagement with people is critical, that it's personal, so that it motivates them to think about the political and social change they need to participate in. And I think that challenge of making the classroom a place where people want to come and want it to be something that they're creating too, rather than something that they enter into and only learn from, but that they're actually responsible to participate and to create while they're there. I think that's the joy of trying to find how do you do that in a classroom space. But when I'm out in the community, it's really about me being the learner, and being willing to share space and letting others determine what their future is, and for them to trust that my motivation for being there is to want to support that trust, to support that will or the motivation they have for change. I really do see my life as enormously built on luck and chance, and I kind of like it that way. I know there's lots of other things that could have happened. It didn't. These are the things that happened in my life so far, and I like that, It's, these big notions we hold on to, like social justice and peace and human rights, and all of these things that every day we're reminded are not happening. The perpetual violence, the willingness to excuse it, to accept it. And I'm human, so there are times when you wonder, like you've spent, I started working with children over 40 years ago. I've been a graduate of Berkeley with my master's degree for 35 years. If I'm not careful, I'll have moments where I'll feel like the world just keeps going back to what it used to be, right? We're currently in a situation where you wonder where things will be. But the other part I know deep down is the world continually evolves. It's continually changing. There's dynamic people all over the world doing amazing things. And so the human effort and the human spirit is so powerful that the ways to harness it is to actually enjoy the collaboration and the work together. And I'm not a very strong proponent of looking for a great model and duplicating it. I deeply believe that people need to engage from the beginning when they want to make a change. What is it that matters to them? What's the purpose of their energy and effort? And if that really matters to them, then are they willing to take the time and effort to work on it together and trust that whatever they create is going to be in the vision that they want, and to pursue that. And that even though that sounds, what's the right word, a little small scale or provincial, or I don't see any reason that every activity has to be enlarged to a scale in which it can serve everyone or do everything. Because again, I don't believe that's actually possible. So I think it's so important that people invest energy locally, invest energy directly and together, and that they manifest not only a change as a collective group of people, but they'll find that internally they gain such enormous strength and will that encourages them to continually attempt other activities and other efforts. And I would say my experience has continually been reinforced to see that happen. That things change and that the world around us puts different pressures and creates different challenges, yes. And so part of the resistance and part of the efforts to create have to consciously take those things into your factoring of what you're going to do. But from doing that, you stimulate different kinds of activities in people. I know that sounds kind of abstract, but I can just look back over my life and know that it's been reaffirmed for me over and over. And I think what I try to offer to my students is that I know who they are. What I mean by that is that they come with desires and hopes and fears, and that's equally part of the educational learning experience, besides other kinds of knowledge that they're trying to acquire. And so that what I love about them is they become more fully realized as unique people, and they take their uniqueness and they make choices about what they're going to do with their life. And I just hope that they continue to love the idea that they're more conscious of the choices that they make, and they're more committed to the choices that they want to fulfill. And I have some wonderful people in my life that keep in touch and let me know that they're doing that. Yeah.
I want to ask about obstacles to being able to practice and teach in the way that you describe. And yet you mentioned that maybe the principles and ideals and values and philosophies that you move out from might be too abstract. I don't think they are. I think it's really clear. But I wonder if maybe you could combine, okay, here's how I move through space, and here are the obstacles that make it really difficult, not just for you, but for social workers that maybe have a similar vision. Like, what are the obstacles that get in the way of sort of starting where the client is, this value we've had for like 100 years that somehow has disappeared in practice because people come in with these models of here's how best practice is going to work and you're going to fit into it. So I don't know if any of that, if I'm being clear or not, but I just think, wow, what are the obstacles you run into, Ken, and how do you process or respond to those? And keep going, because you're saying how important it is to do that.
Yeah, I don't know if this will help provide a clarity of how I think and work, but I'm never driven by a certain outcome. Yes, I want particular things to change so that people are treated with greater dignity, or people have greater voice in the decisions, or simply get to make their own decisions. So yes, I'm always going to be pushing and driving towards those as outcomes for the kinds of things I want to see happen. The obstacles are constant because it's the plus and minus of everything. So this may sound most of us want something in particular. For me, what I want most of all is for people to have opportunities and possibilities. So for me, it's not the narrowing to a certain outcome that I'm looking for or a certain successful result. What I'm looking for is, can people participate in their lives and be in an environment, either they take their own personal volition, their energy to make their own choices, or that we create contexts in which making multiple choices are possible and acceptable for people to do. So the obstacles are there. When you're teaching, we had a semester system, right? So when you're teaching, class is supposed to end after 15 weeks and you're supposed to grade people. Well, you know how we dealt with that. Well, some people are going to learn enormously, but it's going to take them 18 weeks. So why not allow them 18 weeks to fully realize how important the knowledge is to them and what they're able to do with it? Why decide at 15 weeks they need to be graded and determined how well they've done for that amount of time? So we probably drove everybody nuts at the university, but we would do things like have more incompletes so that students could work over the break and demonstrate that they were really committed to their learning, and they would. That's always the powerful experience. It's not an excuse, it's not a way of getting out of things. If they're motivated, they can talk about it, they have a reason. I think we created that space where if they had a reason, they could come and voice it. And we would entertain it, think it through together, and come up with something. So maybe they finished the course in 20 weeks.
And say a little bit about the obstacles then. What was the feedback from administration?
Well, you get it in every level, right? Because you can't have so many incompletes. They have to close by this date and time. People would question if students generally did well in your class, people would question the integrity and the rigor of your class, right? If you invested an enormous amount of time in each student and they all dramatically increased their abilities to do well, people questioned if you were grading them too easy. You were supposed to have some kind of natural bell curve of grading, when in fact, if you do a wonderful job of bringing people together and people do a wonderful job of supporting each other and everyone does well, then you're perceived as being an easy teacher, or students weren't being challenged or something. So you always have the perception you have to deal with. You have all the structural things, grading deadlines and dates, and you're creating extra paperwork for other people. But, you know, it's like when you work in any system, there's good reasons for the practices that people construct to try to make things move and flow easily. But it has very little to do with the purpose of the activity. So in education, where you're trying to help expand people's thinking and motivate their learning and support their growth, Again, 15 weeks may not fit to somebody. Okay, the bureaucracy expects you to fill out paperwork and do other things. That's what you have to do as your obstacles. But as long as you do those things, you create space for a young person to make that transition to their learning.
Before we lose this, can you also say something about that, how easily that happens in direct practice?
Yes.
So for example, we get punished as faculty, you're too easy. In practice, what I often hear is, oh, well, that social worker is just enabling that family.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes,
and join those obstacles into the language that's used to punish a practice that maybe reflects some of the principles you hold dear.
Oh, the hardest thing for a direct practitioner is then people question your ability to have boundaries. As you said, part of the challenge for the worker is they have a lot to do, and so whenever you start creating exceptions or variations to your work, that does actually create more work on the individual, all right? So if you're a direct practitioner as a social worker and you continually are willing to make adjustments or develop different ways, it adds more burden or work on you because the system itself is still moving the same. That's when you get challenged and questioned. Why are you taking so long? Why are you making these choices? We live in a world where people want to predetermine what people are capable of. And so I think a lot of times for the individual worker it becomes too difficult and too stressful to continually work against an environment that encourages you to fit to it. I think that's a big challenge. I understand it because the system and our public services are critical in serving many people. And we have a built-in obstacle in these services because we never fund them at the ability or the level they need. So we create these tensions with policies that are well-intentioned but the funding that doesn't match the need. And then the burden falls on the individual worker or the organization. So it's understandable why the practices get built up. But the whole notion of being a master-level social worker in particular, but any social worker by education, should be able to look at that and see where's the justice in this, where's the compassion in this, and how can I generate my work to work within this agency and still meet the needs of this particular person in the most compassionate and most just way. What people fail to see is usually built into the system are actual activities that you can do. The difficulty is on the worker, though, because you do then take on an extra effort, extra burden. And if you think structurally or institutionally, in part that's why it's built that way. You have to make the extra effort in order for something different to happen. And if you think of it in a systemic way, if it's a burden on an individual, ultimately at some point it becomes too difficult for the individual to continually do that. The cost becomes greater on them, the way others judge their work, the other ways that people talk to them and question their choices. But also just sheer energy and time becomes difficult for the worker. So I think the obstacles are so surreal, and so I don't ever want anyone I work with or suggest to them that they have to. But I think many of the people that I've had the opportunity to teach and to maintain contact with and work with and learn from and watch grow, they do know which situations require them to do something more. And the beauty of so many of them is in those moments, no matter how tired they are, they're willing to do that because they know it makes a difference in another person's life. So I sure don't want to make it sound like it's just something easy, or it is the perennial problem between an organized professional effort, which is wonderful. I'm proud that I'm a social worker, and more importantly, I'm particularly committed to public services because that is our own statement as a country to ensure that those who don't have, to ensure that those who are dispossessed, those who are disenfranchised, can continue to have the support and access that we say we believe in. The challenge is that there's such negativity toward public service that's been generated politically for so many years that often if you're a strong supporter of public service but also are wanting people to think critically about the changes we need to make, it's painful. People particularly begin to feel as if they're just being criticized or attacked while they're working in such difficult circumstances. But it's far from that. It's that our public services ought to be the model in which we demonstrate how we treat people in this country. And as social workers, it should clearly show in every action that we do that we make the choice that justice is more important, that compassion is the way we can do this work, and that the belief is why we do this work is that people deserve the rights to have access and opportunities. So again, it's like, it's kind of like if you're going to go into social work, you can't be surprised that there are struggles. You have to actually love the fact that you're locating yourself in a position in which you're not sure what those struggles will look like, but that you're dedicated to the idea and wanting to build your skills and your partnerships and your coalitions to recognize that there will be struggles in which it will require all of us to work on to make some change. I really do believe that people are able to be inspired, not in a romanticized way, but inspired because they are able to look at situations and think of them critically and begin to imagine ways that it can be improved and seek ways to begin that process. And as they do that, they create their own inspiration to continue. I love the fact that I'm in touch with many of our graduates and just knowing what they're doing. It's just powerful to hear how they contend with all kinds of things, still raise their own families and enjoy their lives, but they take every opportunity to try to extend or expand or create possibilities for people. And I hope that they're enriched by those experiences, just like my life has been.
So, earlier, Ken, you were talking about the sort of grounding yourself in the historical time of the 60s and 70s and the losses that we had and the struggles we identified. And yet during that time there was a great deal of hope and a lot of very progressive, empathic policies and practices emerged that were based on justice and compassion and participation. I wanted to know a little bit about how you see this time in history, how it is impacting like you said, the belief of public service, the ability to work for the values that you mentioned. What is it like now, and how is it different than when you were emerging as a social worker?
Well, I think where the challenge is for those of us who've been engaged in different activities. We're hearing and we're experiencing a return to certain ideas that tend to divide us and that tend to encourage fear or hate of other people. And I think in that kind of climate, young people are growing up thinking in many ways that a lot of our issues are either or. You're either for this or you're for that, and that those are clearly the only ways you can communicate with one another and the only ways that you can engage in these changes or struggles that need to happen. For some of us, it feels like a retrenchment back to ideas that disenfranchise many people. But it's more than that. And I think why I'm struggling a little bit is, clearly at the immediate moment we're in a world where not only locally or domestically, internationally, there's all kinds of challenges occurring. Is it different than it was 40 years ago or 30 years ago? No. I just think that certain things are sharper. I think the issues were there. As a child growing up and seeing the power of what racism can do to people, that people who don't know the person next to them can think they have the right to spew hate and deny someone access to something just because they want to. That was there 40 years ago, 80 years ago, so it's not new. I think we went through a short period in our history where people tried to identify that as not an acceptable way to own businesses, to provide services, or do things. And I think underneath it were always people who believe they should have that right. So I think we're just living in a time now where, given certain circumstances politically that are occurring, that people feel they have a right to voice that. So I think as a beginning social worker now, I think the challenge is not to put too much weight or stock into the kind of rhetoric that's surrounding a lot of the issues and discussion. And maybe that's why I have much more confidence in some of the experiences I've had, which is don't let the larger context of news and experiences, they of course affect all of us and impact us because they are real, they're actually happening. But in your local area, there are plenty of people who want their lives to get better. There's plenty of people who want their children to be safe and have opportunities. And if you have the political will or the emotional energy, start those conversations locally. Because what I've always found is that this sort of larger, what we might use the term narrative now, this voice that says this is how the world is, it's really not the world. It is part of the world, but there are lots of other voices and lots of other experiences going on. And the challenge is, how do you equally surface them so that their voices can be heard? So the variations of what people are experiencing and the chances that people can have in their local areas, it's so important for it to counter, particularly if they're negative messages that are coming. Of course, whether it's policies like immigration that can invade a home and simply remove people on a spur of the moment, yes, those are happening, and those are some things that are larger that need to be countered. But you can also counter them locally by changing the dialogue in your local communities and creating ways that people want to build partnerships and safety and care and concern for one another. And it's happening. People are doing it in different places, so it's not like it isn't. I think as a social worker, and particularly if you're young and growing up with the past 10 years experience or so, I think it's really important to step back and, on one level, learn from history, look at where some of the past actions have been. But I actually put more stock into the fact that if you, and I'm experiencing this now, if you talk to people and help them to try to articulate deep down what really matters to them, they're hard-pressed as an individual after they've done that to believe they should have any right to suppress anybody else's feelings like that, any thoughts like that. And so then they have to sit and struggle with, but what if other people have different ideas or different thoughts? And I think it's an honest struggle. And I think it's a challenge. Are there things that I value or believe in? Yes, and I do think there's ways to articulate that to people. But I'm not concerned if they differ from me about that. What I want them to be able to do is to go deeper and look at themselves and think, if these things matter to me, why would I want to limit or restrict other people's lives, right? And so that may sound like a very individualistic, personal level, but I do think that you have to generate some energy in which that person begins to look at larger political issues through a different lens. And they can't do that in the dialogues that are going on now at a national level or an international level, where it's basically about hating people or fearing people. But when you can get back down to this level where you begin to recognize that if you're having these thoughts and feelings, how could it be that someone, just by the difference of their skin or their culture, not have these same wishes or thoughts or worries for their own children or their own families? And if you can connect to that thought, then you can begin to question this larger narrative that somehow we're not safe because of certain people, and begin to want to do something about that. And like I said before, I'm not motivated that people have to choose a particular source of action or a particular direction. I just think that they need to be guided in their sense of possibilities by a deep, compassionate sense that everyone has a purpose to be here in this world, and the other, which is that we want to live in a world that's just and fair to all. And if you hold on to those two things, they tend to guide you into the choices you make, and have confidence in that. It might sound simplistic, but I think there are so many different avenues that people participate in. You know, there was a time in my life when I was younger, I used to get down on myself, because like, here I was working with young children, right? And I'm thinking like, hey, the whales got to be saved, and the redwood forest has got to be saved, and you know, the rights of people in another country are terrible, and just feeling inadequate that I was doing so little in the world when so much needed to be done. And I can't even say what actually helped me shift my thinking a little, but I do know that what happened for me is I started to realize, you know, there's a lot of beautiful people in the world working every day, taking on enormous challenges and facing huge struggles in their own communities and not being afraid to do it. And that there are people working to save the whales, and there are people working to save the forests. Then I just needed to do my part in the world, and that I had to have confidence that other people were doing their part, and that there will be times when we all come together around some other issue that we all need to be partners in. But I didn't have to feel bad that I wasn't doing all these hundreds of things that needed to be done. I just needed to commit myself to doing something as best as I could, and to work towards the kinds of humanistic changes that I believe are essential. And I think once I made that shift, then I began to pay attention more to really looking and seeing how many people are doing wonderful things, rather than somehow focusing it on myself and thinking somehow I needed to figure these things out. I think what I started realizing is I need to find out who is doing these things, and started to recognize and learn from a variety of people and their efforts. I remember in 95 or 94 was the year of the woman, and in Beijing, China, women advocates, activists all came together. And one of them was a graduate of Berkeley, a classmate of mine, and she had started a women's shelter in the Bay Area, and she hosted a conference shortly after that, and had women from, I believe, Vietnam, Cambodia, India, few other countries. And they came and they were speaking about the activism that they were generating in their own communities. And in some of those communities, the risk is life, literally. And here's this person talking about how they're talking with other women, organizing small groups, raising funds, and you're thinking their life is at risk. It's not like you're going to go to jail. You're going to get killed. And you see the power of them choosing to do that with their lives. And every one of them, when they talk, they're not talking about themselves. They're talking about a group of other women doing that together with them. And it told me right away that in every context, there's an enormous courage of people to come together and do things, right? So in some ways, by living in the United States, yes, great risks happen too, but in general, I always felt like the risk of any choice I'm making is so minor compared to this beautiful work that's going on in the world. So I would say, for future generations, you cannot allow the construct of fear to drive your choices. You have to construct a vision of faith and belief about the capacity of people. And then from that emerges choices that you'll make today, and not feel bad if it's not all that you think it should be, but do it, be involved in it, because out of that experience will grow other experiences. I'm just a firm believer that in the end you have to challenge yourself. Do you believe in the capacity of people to care, to love one another, and to make a difference in the world? And if you believe that, you're always going to find other people who will join you. You're never alone in the process. So, are the obstacles great? Always. Do the obstacles change in every generation? Probably, to some extent. But if you kind of distill them down, it's not to, in this country in particular, different in other countries, but in this country in particular, it's not to be so attracted to privilege and not to be so attracted to comfort, because those will get in the way. But if you're able to see that lives could be better, and have the motivation to want to see if other people care, I think every time anyone does that, they always find a larger circle than they expected of people willing to participate and willing to try. I think we've just lived in a country where people think at some point I can't do it for my own welfare. And I think it happens too quick. I think there are a lot of experiences people could have if they just extended themselves just a little bit more, just a little bit longer, and then recognize that it's well within their capacity to do. So I think the obstacles are always there, but at Central, it's not to be afraid.
So I don't know if this will be easy for you to respond to, because you have a lot of humility and humbleness about your practice and how you move through space. But it might be nice for people to hear about what has been successful in your life, what has felt really good in the practice of social work. Because I know you've been really successful at a lot of things, a lot of endeavors and many efforts, whether it's individuals, families, communities, board of directors, tribes.
As long as it's hard to say it's my success. So as long as part of the conversation is able to really hear, I love so much of the things I've been a part of, right, with others. One, I would say, for us to have constructed a graduate program at Humboldt, making that effort and choice, living where we were in Humboldt County, the long history of Humboldt County, between the tribes and between the settlers who came. I think it was critical that the social work program make a commitment and focus on an educational process that informed and prepared future social workers to understand the indigenous communities of the Northwest there. And that it ultimately, and I hope it's moving in that direction, that it ultimately be taught and run by indigenous people in the area. It still touches me a great deal to think about the chances and the trust and the risks that our tribal friends and community partners took in supporting us, because the social work program is part of a larger system. It's part of a state university system. It's part of a community in which most services are provided by the local governments. And those have been historically the largest systems that deny the rights of tribal people, deny the history, and have a lack of respect for the integrity of tribes. And so for us to have worked together to try to create a graduate program that for the future, hopefully, is going to continually encourage new social workers to think about the importance not only of where they are, why place is so important, and understand that relationship historically, but I want to manifest some of the best that we can, not just respecting, but engaging actively, living and thinking in different ways, like many of the tribes do, with all the suffering and all of the impact of colonization, the difficulties between settlers who believe that they've earned the rights to land and property, and the differences in beliefs about how to share that space, the rivers, the environmental conditions we work and live in. But I think the beauty there was that when we made that effort or sought out to make that effort, it was so meaningful to have partners in our tribes willing to work and support us in that effort, not knowing really how it could turn out. And their courage and their willingness to do that, I think meant a great deal, to the extent that my part in trying to make sure that that program happened really was to fulfill that trust and that hope that that program would be different. It's going to face all kinds of challenges for a long time, but it exists, and it can now be a place in which those challenges can be made public, and they can be the challenging kinds of dialogue that should be happening in social work that becomes possible now. So I would say that's like one thing that's, of course, more recent and particularly important to me that I was a part of. But I think about other kinds of things too. In Humboldt County, being a rural county, it's interesting how people, and I did too when I moved up there, perceive a rural area, But the interesting thing, and I think it goes back to my reason I was highlighting, just ultimately having a confidence or faith in people wherever you're at. A lot of my work in Humboldt was initially with people who probably had no common values or beliefs that I did. I mean, really, I think when I look back, I think my attitude, my way of thinking, my perceptions were probably very different than theirs. But the beauty of the people that I had a chance to meet and work with, whether it was on the Humboldt Area Foundation Board or whether out in the community for organizations or in the county, people could be moved to look at what the concern was in the community, and then be willing to work together to do that. And I think there's a lot that goes on in rural communities that urban and suburban areas would be well advised to rethink and re-examine of what's happened. At the same time, I'd like to think my work has always been sort of I always try to think a nice name because I think it would be easier for people to hold on to, but it never works. But I really think of it as sort of a border worker. And a border worker in the sense that, like right now in my life, or up in Humboldt, the importance really isn't whether it's rural or urban. There's an interface in different ways of living and the different needs that impact the economies of both, that impact the welfare of people. And so it's really critical that people work to continually cross that line, whatever that border is between people's perceptions of rural and urban, and that as social workers that we're not afraid to straddle both worlds all the time. I think being a Japanese American and growing up in a predominantly white community forced me to try to figure out, well, what is it that I take from home, and what is it that I take from school that I bring back home, and how does that all come together, right? When I worked in the Bay Area, just seeing, particularly working with children with special education, how do they get to be an active part of their communities if we already segregate them out from other experiences that other young people get to have? So how do you create a world in which people get to move back and forth and actually learn from each other and generate some kind of power of working together? I think in Humboldt County, for me, all of that came together. You know, I had opportunities on so many different ways to be a part of the community, and in so many moments, all these different aspects came together, right? Whether it was First Five and the foundation or the university or human services, they all kind of came together at different times for different purposes. And it was wonderful to see that once you could bring those groups of people together or be a part of being together, people were willing to rethink their positions and create different options. Rural areas are going to continually struggle. We have a economic and a political structure that really does not recognize rural life anymore, and it's going to be a dramatic impact as time continues on rural areas. What I think and I wish the work at Humboldt was a reminder to everyone is that when we do work together, there are ways that we can build stability and care and affection for one another in our communities while facing these larger forces that are impacting life. I think rural areas are going to continue to have their ups and downs because of it. The honesty is urban areas are suffering too, and so I think how to help bridge those two worlds has always been critical.
I think too about the people you've been in touch with for many, many years who you worked with at one point as a social worker, either instructor or clinician. Don't those in some way feel like successes, however you want to frame it? Because like you say, you hear them, you know what I'm saying, Ken?
Yes,
yeah.
I do. And I was, the hardest part about leaving teaching is that that was my location and opportunity to meet so many wonderful people, right? And like you said, I've had the privilege of keeping in touch with a number of them over many years now. And when I see who they were when I met them and what they're doing with their lives now, it's always wonderful. I can't take any credit for that, though, so that I don't see it that way in terms of like the word success or anything like that. But what I do see in the experience is that it continually reinforces for me the belief I have about people. Some of them were, you met them and you knew they were destined to do all kinds of things because there's just no way anybody was going to get in their way. That's who they were. And so you were just privileged to meet them and help them have some early experiences because they were just going to go wherever. But I also have wonderful memories and deep regard for individual students who came, were uncertain about their future, maybe had experienced a family tragedy or something difficult early in their life that kind of threw them off balance for a while, lacked a sense of confidence or wondered where they were going, what their future was going to be. And so it's just so beautiful to see how they struggled and learned to find ways to acknowledge what they were experiencing and then begin to find ways that mattered to them and to see what they're doing. And again, I can't see them as personal successes, but I sure love the fact that I was able to be a part of their life. And I think that's the part of teaching that I miss a great deal, the honesty, the genuineness of theirs to share and to try to find that delicate balance between being patient with themselves while wanting to have experiences that are meaningful for themselves, and having to be in situations sometimes where that's not at that moment possible, and not being afraid to stay there and to get the most out of that experience before recognizing they can move on or make changes or make an impact. So I definitely not a personal success, but feel so happy that I was a part of that. Yes.
My guess is, as someone listens to you, they would want to know, how do you stay with the struggle? You've referred to the struggle being that's what it is. How does one stay with that and not retreat? Or does one retreat sometimes?
Yeah, I think I think people have to have some clarity if these things matter or not to them, for whatever reasons, however they come to it. Because there's going to be periods where you're too tired to continue, or there's going to be times where you're questioning what you're involved in. And those are great times to step back and reflect, think about what is really important. Is that activity or that effort so central to you, or are there other possibilities? But I think how you stay knowing that the larger struggle is really about human rights, about really the dignity of all people, and how do you participate in it so that you're not denying people the opportunities that you seek for yourself. When you're in that kind of struggle, which is going to be constantly challenged, there should be times when people take a respite or take a break. But you can do that if you're confident that that is what matters to you, because you can come back from a respite or come back from a break. But if you're doubting it and you don't know if that's what you should be doing and you're feeling tired, then it's very hard to believe that you can go back to a struggle that took so much energy or effort previously. So I'm not suggesting it's for everyone, but I think everyone is capable of identifying what those things are that matters to them, what really gives meaning and purpose to their lives. And when they make that effort, I think the sweet thing is that they find that it actually generates more energy. It provides more insight and provides more support for their efforts, so that they have a much greater capacity to stay with the struggle. Yeah, I don't know any other way to say that, because I don't think there's a way to convey that other than that people need, most of all in their lives, to have meaning and purpose, and not get caught up in other superficial, I can't say superficial, that's not fair, other things that feel important. I think if they can find that core in themselves, they'll always experience that it generates more energy, and gives much more substance to their experiences every day. Yeah, I don't know how else to say that.
I think a story would be helpful. Like, is there a story or an example or experience that you remember where you were facing something that was difficult and you stayed with it? And how did you do that? And if you pulled back for a while, how did you know you needed to pull back? Like, is there a story or behind that about you?
Well, I think one would be when I first started up at Humboldt. Quite honestly, I wasn't very familiar or aware of the tribes up there. And one of my first students I worked with, I think I felt, and I knew the circumstances a bit. I knew that he felt very close to someone who was no longer teaching. Part of my teaching was now going to impact his life instead of somebody who was much more important or close or precious to him. And there he was in his last year to graduate, and he was going to have to work with somebody he didn't know. And I think at first I just thought, maybe I just need to keep my distance so that he can have his space, and it would be unrealistic for me to think that we can feel like we're working closely together. I know that I made some overtures, and I know that in some ways he was making overtures, but I think there was a certain period of time where it just didn't have a feeling like it could go anywhere, I think. But once we started to connect and started to talk and to start doing things, he was so generous to me. And I think there was times where I felt very uncertain how much I could be involved or offer. And I think, honestly, there are times when I feel like it would be better if I step back and somebody else is there. And I think in that situation there were moments where I felt like that, because I knew I didn't understand some things, right? And I felt his passion and motivation and desire, and I wondered if, I think it's when you have that moment where you can't help but wonder if you're going to disappoint someone's needs, desires, and you want to meet it so much, right? That I think that would be, in a different way maybe, but in a way that I can articulate, one of the places where the challenge to not rush and be able to sit with it, and sit with those times where I felt I didn't know, and allow myself to be there, trusting that it wasn't my knowledge he was really wanting. He really needed a space where he could emerge with his knowledge and what he wanted to do. And what I needed to do was be able to be a presence for him to do that. And I think that place where I had to kind of catch myself and not have to feel like I had to prove myself or provide something or do the right thing, but not be afraid to stay stay engaged together with him, and not be afraid that I had to learn so much in the process, that I didn't have to fear that I didn't have anything to offer, that I just needed to be able to be present with him. I think our relationship emerged out of that time, that I will always be grateful for, and it mattered a great deal to me, and I think that's a great example of where I could have, I know we were talking about taking breaks and stuff like that, but for me, that's a great example where the fear to persist is a mental activity. It's constructed in a way in which I'm creating that fear, and I'm wondering, and I'm beginning to feel disappointed with myself. All those things start to happen that takes me away from being present. And the moment I let go of that and simply be present, then all that drifts away, and the reality of what that interaction is becomes more and more important and comfortable to be there. So I think there's been times in my life where I could have easily made a choice where things wouldn't have emerged because I was so starting to feel I needed to take care of myself. But by just slowing myself down and being present, really allowed that. It's also a way of having gratitude for being in the world, you know? It's not a world, the world's constructed, or we believe it's constructed in a way where we always have to prove ourselves in some ways. If you can let go of that, then you actually begin to appreciate how amazing people are, or how amazing the world is. And when you're in that state of mind, then you're freed, in the sense that it's not about proving. It's not about you coming up with the answer or you doing something in the moment. If you're being present for someone and it's for them, they're in the process of trying to create, imagine, do something. Just being able to be present with them and to participate in watching that emerge from them, it's so beautiful, and it's the important part of our relationships to one another. And if I pulled it back in a full circle, I have this image, and I wanted to share it as I'm talking. You know, one of the things my mother's life changed so much because when she was in Japan, she worked in finance, and she was one of the few women doing it in this area, and it was very special. She was so bright and obviously competent that you have photos of like 8 to 10 Japanese businessmen all standing looking very serious, and then either my mom or another woman on either end flanking them. Clearly they worked in the same bank, but they obviously were the only women, or the only woman sometimes. And then here she comes to the United States, becomes a farmer's wife, right? But what she used to do every morning is she would take a few minutes to start her day by doing the Nembutsu, a Buddhist chant. And probably the simplest way to put it is that you're basically expressing your appreciation for being at one with the world, being part of the world, right? And that's how she would start her day before she'd start cooking breakfast or cleaning the house or doing whatever she was going to be doing. And that image of her sitting for a few minutes to start her day, there's one I can picture in the bedroom where there was a little shrine of her parents, and she would be doing the Nembutsu in front of it, or in this living room where they had a little shrine. I know for myself in so many situations where I've walked into either a family that was in the midst of violence, and I was walking into it and I wasn't sure what was going to happen, or whether I was teaching or giving a talk at a conference or something, and I could start to feel my own anxiety starting to overtake my thinking. The sweet thing is I can actually bring up that image of her And the moment I bring up that image of her, then I can do it, whatever that is. And what it usually helps me do is it usually helps me slow down. It usually helps me listen to people, and it allows me to feel like I'm okay. I'm here. This is where I'm supposed to be right now. And that image of being able to draw her up in my mind in so many situations has allowed me to try something I've never experienced before. I'll go and I'll think, why am I doing this? I have no idea what's going to happen. And then I'll just hold that memory for a little bit. And then I know I can go into the space and see what happens. I think the experiences I've had over and over is that if people could find some way to not try to translate their fear into activity, but just hold it and go into the space, it's a feeling, so it will change. And if you have that trust of that, then you're able to take in what's going on. And the more you take in, the more your mind begins to think about what's possible. So it's so awkward and weird to talk about yourself, and it's so strange in some ways for me because I'm not like somebody who's pursued one area of practice deeply. I didn't just do mental health like I started, nor did I stay in teaching for my whole career. But I think what I've tried to develop for myself as a way of thinking about my work and my practice is that there's ways I think about the world, and I've wanted to learn ways to actualize that in my being. And I'm human, so I don't do it well all the time. But there is a core to me that I wanted to generate and to imagine that if I could be this way wherever I went and whatever I did, my work would manifest itself. It would emerge in that way. So whether I was teaching or doing therapy or as a school social worker or working out in the community or working for the foundation, trying to help start another foundation up north, just any of those activities, I think I've learned who I am, and I've figured out that that's about all I have to offer. So I might as well bring that all to every place I go. And that's, my social work practice. I wish the best for anyone who wants to be a social worker, but I think they can't be afraid that to one, acknowledge the injustices in the world, to not be afraid to learn and see how much inequality exists, and then not be afraid to pursue making the world more just. And whatever that effort takes, whatever that journey is for them, to believe in it and to follow it. The first students I've worked with, and to see many making choices and doing what they do with their lives, is just so enriching to know that that's what they've done. They've figured out what matters to them. It may look very different than me and anybody else, but it's what matters to them, and they've pursued it, they're shaping it, and their life is going to be better for it.
This image of your mother is really powerful as a source of support and strength and centering. What have been the other sources of support for you over the years?
Pam, year
Where
one.
Where did you find the support?
I always, if you go over your lifetime, how lucky, that's what I mean by luck. I see my life as lucky because I could have made other choices and I wouldn't have met certain people, right? So definitely I come to Humboldt, I meet you and John. You both gave me so much space to just figure out and find my way, and yet you supported me in so many ways. Earlier, I ended up at San Mateo County Mental Health because I was riding the BART train, and a woman overheard me, and she happened to be a friend of a friend, and he was able to give her my name, and then we met, and I ended up with a job running an adolescent program, and I had never run adolescent programs before. But my life in San Mateo County Mental Health was wonderful. I was given so much room to make decisions, create things, work, create different partnerships, see the children and families whatever way I thought they needed. Yeah, I put in a lot of time and effort, but I loved it because I could do it the way I thought. So, that was amazing. I worked with a wonderful social worker for the county that we partnered around working with children with speech and language disabilities, and it was an amazing partnership. I learned so much from her. So I can go back to thinking how just these things, you're the little Japanese kid at the elementary school, and everybody else is basically white. There's just a couple of us who are Japanese, and maybe one or two Mexican American kids in my class at the time. No African Americans until I was in junior high school. You're different. When friends come over your house, the odor of cooking and everything is so different and foreign to them. They're not being mean or hurtful when they were going, ooh, what is that, right? It's that they don't know. Well, I used to go to their house, and their parents would pour me a glass of milk, and it's like, I cannot drink milk. But they put it in front of you, and you feel guilty if you don't drink it, right? On the other hand, you think of every possible excuse why you can't drink it too, You learn to be creative. But coming out of that background where in my face every day I knew I was both different but the same as my peers. And had great friends, but I knew I was experiencing things differently than them. And I think out of that I've come to love working with so many diverse ethnic communities that I've had the chance to work with, and families, because I know there's a different story there, and that they're often cautious or afraid to tell it. But it's allowing it to emerge that allows them to be themselves, and by being themselves, they're more honest about what would be helpful or what would be hopeful for them. And it's in that interaction that's so beautiful to have with people. So there's just so many influences in my life. Harry Specht was one, and in fact why I'm doing the work I do now is only because of him, really. Harry, I remember one time Harry said to me, why don't you come back for grad school? And I said, why would I go to grad school? The only thing you can do with a PhD is teach. He somehow tolerated that and continued to be an incredible supporter and encouraging person in my life. So, I just, you just have to feel lucky that you have these experiences. And I think that's why when I'm working with students whose lives have been very difficult, that they haven't had people in their lives, it is of particular importance to me that the honesty of their life can be shared and it can be acknowledged, and at the end of it they still have belief and support and confidence that they can go through school and be successful and make the efforts that they want, because if there hadn't been a person in their life, then they need to have the faith and hope that there will be a person in their life available to them. And part of my work is to encourage them not to give up, really. So I look at my experiences, countless people, and because I cared about what was going on in the world when I was much younger, I was inspired by people like Robert F. Kennedy and others. I saw people struggling with the times, with the struggles we had around civil rights peaking at that point, the anti-war movement, and seeing all kinds of different messages going from both ends that sometimes were productive, sometimes weren't. So growing up in a larger world where there was a lot of tension and struggle, I think that too manifested in the people that I wanted to be attracted towards or look towards or hope from. And I would say the same thing is happening today. You know, there's a lot of things going on that are painful and discouraging and hurtful. But like I said before, there's always amazing people doing some amazing work, and if people can find ways to not be afraid to acknowledge the reality of what's happening, but simultaneously seek out those that are making a difference, they'll see ways to move forward in their lives and not be discouraged. Yes. How do you get to this place in life where your career has really been behind you now, you know? I often introduce myself as I'm still teaching. Well, I'm not teaching, I'm administering a program, but I work with students, and so I have workshops and orientations with them. And I don't get to see them as much as I'd like. But, you know, I introduce myself as an old fart because I want them to be okay with, like, being around old people, you know? And people try to soften it, you know? They're like always, oh, no, you're so young, da-da-da. No, I'm old, you know, and it's actually a good thing because I'm still alive. I'm still here. And I think it is important to change the perceptions of aging in our country and change our culture from such a youth focus to really a culture that loves life and sees the beauty of every stage of life. And that hopefully that is what we generate in people, you know, in social work. That it really doesn't matter what age or what circumstance. Our goal is to dignify their lives and to create opportunities for them. So I'm at a good stage in my life where, yeah, I don't like the aches and pains and all of those things, but I like being old. I do. There have been wonderful people in my life. I hope for some that have needed somebody in their life at that moment, I hope I didn't overlook that opportunity to be there for them.
That sounds like a beautiful note to end on, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you.